All right, get ready to dive back into the shadows with us because today we're talking vampires, gothic horror, and one director's lifelong obsession with a certain iconic bloodsucker. Whether you're a horror fanatic or just curious about how a classic gets reimagined, this deep dive is going to get under your skin. We're dissecting a YouTube video essay all about the 2024 Nosferatu remake. Comparing it to the 1922 original, seeing what's new, what's different, what's maybe a little controversial.
And trust me, there's plenty to unpack there.
Oh, I bet. Especially since this director, what's his name? Edgar, right?
Edgar, yep.
He's known for being super meticulous, like almost obsessed with historical accuracy.
Which you think would be a good thing, right? For a period piece like this. But the essay actually argues that it might be a downside in this case.
Oh, really? Now that's interesting. Okay, so the essay starts off by talking about Edgar's history with Nosferatu.
Yep.
Apparently this wasn't just another project for him. This was like a childhood obsession brought to life.
It goes deep. Imagine this. Little Edgar sees a picture of Max Schreck in full Count Orlok getup, and boom! That's it. He's hooked. Even staged a high school production. The whole 9 yards.
Wow, talk about dedication. I mean, that level of passion can be amazing for a filmmaker, but it can also be, well, kind of a curse, can it?
It's a double-edged sword for sure.
I know.
On one hand, you've got this intense passion fueling every decision, every detail. But on the other hand, you risk getting so caught up in honoring the original that you lose sight of what made it work in the first place.
You almost become a slave to the source material instead of using it as inspiration to create something new.
Exactly. And that brings us to one of the remake's biggest departures from the original, the character of Ellen.
Yeah, she's definitely not your typical damsel in distress this time around.
Not even close. This remake flips the script, giving Ellen a lot more agency, a lot more depth. She's not just reacting to Orlok, she's grappling with him, almost like they're in this weird dance together.
Hold on, I gotta ask, what do you mean by grappling? The essay kept using this phrase, mutual entrapment, and I wasn't quite sure what they meant by it.
Right, good question. So, in the original, it's pretty black and white. Orlok is the monster, Ellen is the victim. But in the remake, their relationship is way more complicated. It's like they're both drawn to each other, even as they fear each other.
Ooh, now that is interesting. So there's like a push and pull there, a sense that maybe Ellen isn't completely helpless, that maybe there's something about Orlok that she's drawn to, even if it's dangerous.
And that raises all sorts of questions, right? About desire, sacrifice, the blurry lines between victimhood and agency.
Exactly. It's not just a simple horror story anymore. It's like it's tapping into these deeper psychological themes. Makes me even more curious about Lily Rose Depp's performance as Ellen. The essay mentions some mixed reviews, though.
Yeah, some critics loved the nuance she brought to the role, how she portrayed this woman wrestling with these complex emotions. But others felt she was overshadowed by Nicholas Hoult, who plays Thomas.
Makes sense. Casting in remakes is always tricky. You're trying to honor the original, but also bring something fresh to the table.
And that's true for the visual style, too. Get ready for a visual shock, because this remake is the polar opposite of the original's stark simplicity.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Picture this. The original Nosferatu is all shadows and suggestion, right? Minimalist, almost dreamlike. This remake is like stepping into a perfectly preserved historical diorama.
Wow, so they went all out, huh? Every detail, every costume, perfect.
Exactly. The essayist even used the word museum piece to describe it. And while that's visually impressive, it makes you wonder if it loses some of that creepy, unsettling atmosphere that the original had.
Yeah, I can see that. Like, if everything's perfectly lit and in focus, you lose that sense of lurking shadows, the unknown.
Right. The essayist specifically talked about Thomas's arrival at Orlok's castle. They said it was visually spectacular, like nightmarish, but the dialogue felt flat, almost too explanatory, you know?
So, like, they were trying too hard to make things clear instead of just letting the visuals and the atmosphere do the work.
Precisely. It's interesting to think about how different filmmaking eras approach horror. The original Nosferatu used shadows, suggestion, what you didn't see, to create dread.
And this remake is like, hey, look at all this cool historical detail.
Oh.
Which might be interesting, but not necessarily scary.
It's a different kind of horror, for sure. Okay, so we've talked about the director's vision, the visual style. But what about the Count himself? How does Bill Skarsgård's Orlok measure up to the classic portrayal?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? How do you reimagine such an iconic monster?
Well, get this. Skarsgård's Orlok isn't just a monster. There's a surprising amount of pathos to him.
Pathos, like he's actually sympathetic.
In a way, yeah. He's still terrifying, don't get me wrong, but there's a sadness to him, a sense of loneliness even. He's not just this embodiment of pure evil, he's a more complex, more tragic figure.
Okay, now that's a twist I wasn't expecting. How does that change his dynamic with Ellen? Especially with this whole mutual entrapment thing we were talking about earlier.
Well, the essayist argued that this more humanized Orlok actually adds another layer to their relationship. It's not just predator and prey anymore. There's a sense that both characters are trapped by forces beyond their control.
So it's like they're both victims, in a way, each caught in their own kind of prison.
Exactly. But the essayist also pointed out that this concept felt underdeveloped, like a missed opportunity to really dive into the psychology of their connection.
Ah, so a fascinating idea that maybe didn't quite reach its full potential.
Right, and that leads us to what might be the most fascinating and potentially confusing aspect of this remake, its treatment of spirituality.
Oh yeah, you mentioned that before. It's not just vampires and gothic horror. It's got all this Christian, pagan, even occult imagery woven into the story.
It's a wild mix, and the essayist wasn't quite sure what to make of it. It's like the film is trying to say something about the nature of faith, the limits of science, the power of belief, but it all gets a bit muddled.
Okay, so buckle up, listeners, because this is where the deep dive gets really interesting. We're about to explore the spiritual landscape of this Nosferatu, and it sounds like it's going to be a wild ride.
We're talking Christian symbols, pagan rituals, occult backstories. It's all there.
All right, I'm ready. Let's get spooky.
Let's do it.
All right, so let's dig into this spiritual side of the remake. You mentioned it starts with Ellen as a child encountering Orlok. What's going on there?
So picture this. Little Ellen, all alone in the dark, crying out. But instead of, a comforting presence, it's Orlok who shows up. And he's not just any vampire in this version.
Oh, right. He's got that whole occult backstory, right?
Yeah, they really went deep with that. He's like this fallen sorcerer, made a deal with some dark forces, a whole 9 yards. It adds this whole other level of creepiness to him.
Makes him more than just a monster. Like he's tied to these ancient, powerful forces. So how does that play out?
Well, it seems like that encounter with Orlok as a child, it's what awakens Ellen's psychic abilities.
Ah, so it's like a twisted origin story.
Yeah.
Like the trauma of that encounter somehow triggers these powers within her.
Exactly. And it creates this really messed up link between them, right? Like he's both the source of her trauma and the reason she has the potential to maybe, defeat him.
Wow, that is messed up. So their connection is way more complicated than just like hunter and hunted.
Definitely. There's this push and pull, this sense that they're bound together by this dark force. The essay called it, what was it?
Mutual entrapment.
Yeah, that's it. Mutual entrapment. It's like they're both caught in this web, this cycle of darkness.
This is getting deep. Okay, so we've got the Christian imagery, the pagan rituals, this occult backstory for Orlok. How does the film weave all these different spiritual elements together?
Well, that's where things get a little messy. Honestly, I'm not sure the essayist fully figured it out either.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot to juggle. You've got nuns praying for protection, then you've got, like, naked women riding horses over graves. It's a lot.
Right. You go from something familiar, traditional, to something completely bizarre and ancient. And I think the film is trying to say something about the power of belief itself, regardless of what you believe in.
Like whether it's God or ancient deities or something darker. The act of believing holds a power that maybe science can't fully explain.
Maybe, but the film doesn't really give us any easy answers, which is probably for the best. It leaves you questioning, unsettling you a bit.
I could dig that. It's like the film is saying, hey, look, there are things out there we don't fully understand, and maybe our modern reliance on science and logic has blinded us to those things.
Totally. It's a good reminder that we don't have all the answers, and that maybe there are forces at play that we've dismissed or ignored.
And that's where the horror comes in, right?
Hmm.
Because what happens when you ignore those forces, when you refuse to acknowledge the power of the unseen?
Well, the film seems to suggest that it doesn't end well. Like, remember that occult expert character, the one everyone dismisses as crazy?
Oh, yeah. What happens to him?
Let's just say he meets a pretty gruesome end. And all the people who scoffed at his warnings, they don't fare much better.
It's like the film is saying, hey, you might think this is all superstition, but look what happens when you ignore the signs.
Exactly. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of dismissing the unknown, even when it challenges our rational minds, which honestly is pretty relevant to our world today, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about all the misinformation, the conspiracy theories, the way people are willing to believe almost anything these days.
Right. And this film, even though it's set in the past, it speaks to that. It's about the power of belief, both for good and for bad.
It's like a warning. Be careful what you choose to believe, because belief itself can be a powerful force, and it can be used to manipulate and control.
Deep stuff, right?
Yeah, this has gotten really philosophical.
Mhm.
But that's what I love about a good deep dive. You start with something familiar, like vampires, and you end up talking about the nature of belief and the dangers of misinformation.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion, right? You never know what you're going to find underneath.
Exactly. Okay, so we've explored this spiritual side of the remake, which is definitely complex and a little messy, but super interesting. What else did the essay highlight?
Well, the essayist also talked about the music.
Oh yeah, what did they say about it?
They said it was haunting and evocative, which, isn't a huge surprise given the composer.
Oh, who did the score?
It was Mark Corvin.
Wait, Mark Corvin? Like the guy who did The Witch and The Lighthouse?
That's him, the director's go-to guy for creepy soundtracks.
Makes sense. I mean, those films had amazing scores. So unsettling, so atmospheric. I can only imagine what he did with Nosferatu.
The essayist has said it really amplified the film's creepiness, like it added this whole other layer of unease.
So not just a visual feast, but an auditory one too.
Exactly. It's like the music is working with the visuals to create this complete sensory experience, drawing you into the world of the film and making it even more unsettling.
I'm starting to think this director is a real master of atmosphere. He knows how to use sound, visuals, story, everything to create this specific mood, this feeling.
Definitely. He's not just throwing scares at you. He's crafting an experience, a world that you get completely immersed in.
And that's what makes a horror film truly effective.
Right.
It's not about the gore or the jump scares. It's about creating this sense of unease that stays with you long after the film is over.
Totally agree. It's about tapping into those primal fears, the things that lurk in the shadows of our minds.
Okay, so we've covered the visuals, the spiritual stuff, the music. I feel like we're getting a really good sense of what this remake is all about.
Yeah, we've explored a lot of the key elements, but there's one more thing we haven't talked about. The ending.
Oh, right, the ending. You mentioned that it's different from the original, right?
Very different. Remember how in the original Orlok is defeated by, well, the sun?
Yeah, classic vampire weakness, right? Sunlight equals death.
Exactly. But the remake takes a different approach. They give Ellen a much more active role in how things play out.
Okay, spill the beans. How does it end?
I don't want to spoil everything, but let's just say it involves Ellen using her connection to Orlok to, let's say, manipulate the situation.
Oh, so it's more of a psychological battle than a physical one.
You could say that. And the essayist described the ending as both beautiful and ambiguous. Like it leaves you with more questions than answers.
I love that. A good ending should make you think, make you question what you just saw.
Right. And this ending, it sounds like it does exactly that. It leaves you wondering about the nature of their connection, whether Orlok is truly defeated or if something else is going on.
Okay, I'm officially intrigued. I need to see this ending for myself.
You and me both. Sounds like it's one of those endings that stays with you, that you keep thinking about long after the film is over.
Which is the mark of a good horror film, right?
Right.
It gets under your skin and stays with you. It makes you question things. It maybe even haunts your dreams a little.
Exactly. And speaking of haunting, I think it's time we address something we haven't talked about yet. The actual look of Orlok in this remake.
Oh, yeah. I'm curious about that. Did they go for the classic Max Schreck look, or did they do something completely different?
They actually did something really interesting. It's not a direct copy of Shrek, but it's also not totally out there.
So, like a modern take on the classic.
Yeah, I'd say so. They kept some of the key elements, like the long, sharp fingernails, the pointed ears, the overall gauntness.
But Bill Skarsgård is a pretty handsome dude. How did they make him look creepy enough?
Well, they used a lot of makeup and prosthetics, obviously, but they also relied a lot on lighting and shadow to, accentuate his features and create this unsettling effect.
Like playing with those classic horror movie techniques?
Exactly. They were really deliberate about how they used light and shadow to make Orlok look as creepy as possible, even when he wasn't doing anything particularly scary.
Okay, now I'm really starting to see how this director operates. It's all about those subtle details, those layers of atmosphere and suggestion.
Totally. He's not going for cheap scares. He's building a world, a mood, a feeling.
And that's what makes this remake so compelling, right? It's taking this familiar monster and reimagining him for a modern audience, but it's doing it in a way that's both respectful to the original and totally unique.
It's a balancing act for sure, but it sounds like they pulled it off.
I think so too. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the director's vision, the revamped characters, that intense spiritual undercurrent. But you mentioned that this remake is visually stunning, almost to a fault. Let's talk about that contrast with the original style.
Well, if you think about the original Nosferatu, it's all shadows and suggestion. It's minimalist, partly out of necessity because of the limitations of filmmaking back then.
Right, they had to rely on what they couldn't show to create the fear.
Exactly. And that actually worked in its favor. It tapped into our primal fears of the unknown, the things that lurk in the darkness.
A creaking door, a fleeting shadow that's scarier than anything you can actually show on screen.
And that's what this remake, even with its amazing visuals, might be missing a little bit. The essayist called it too polished, like a museum piece.
I get it, like if everything is perfectly lit and in focus, you lose that sense of mystery, of dread.
Exactly. The essayist mentioned that scene where Thomas arrives at the castle. Visually, it's amazing. Nightmarish, they called it. But it lacks that chilling atmosphere of the original.
Interesting. It's like they traded some of that primal fear for historical accuracy.
Maybe it's definitely a different approach. And it makes you wonder, does too much detail, too much perfection actually work against a horror film?
It's a good question. Like, maybe sometimes less is more, especially when it comes to horror.
You might be right, because real fear, it lives in the shadows, in the things we don't fully understand. And that's what the original Nosferatu captured so well.
Yeah, tapped into those primal fears, the things that haunt our nightmares.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got this tension between the original's minimalist style and the remake's visual grandeur. What's the final verdict? Does the essayist think this approach works?
Well, I think it's a matter of taste, isn't it? Some people love that over-the-top visual style, while others prefer the more subtle approach.
Yeah, and I think it depends on what you're looking for in a horror film. Do you want to be bombarded with jump scares and gore, or do you want something that's more atmospheric, more psychological?
Like, do you want to be scared by what you see or by what you imagine?
Exactly. And the 2024 Nosferatu, it seems like it's going for that second option, that psychological unease that lingers long after you've finished watching it.
It's playing with our minds, man. It's like the director is saying, I'm not just going to show you a monster. I'm going to make you feel the monster lurking in the shadows of your own subconscious. Ooh, that's a good way to put it. And I think that's what makes this remake so effective. It's not just about scares. It's about creating this unsettling mood, this atmosphere of dread that seeps into your bones.
It's like a slow-burning poison, right?
Yeah,
It gets into your system and starts to mess with your head.
totally. And it all comes back to that idea of less is more. Sometimes what you don't see is far scarier than anything you could actually show on screen.
You know, it makes me think about those old radio dramas, the ones that just use sound effects and voices to tell a story. Your imagination had to do all the work, and that made it so much creepier.
Oh, yeah. Like, you're listening to these creaking doors, these footsteps in the darkness, and your mind is conjuring up all these terrifying images.
And those images, they're way scarier than anything a special effects team could create because they're your own personal nightmares.
Exactly. They're tapping into your deepest fears, the things that keep you up at night.
So, in a way, this remake is kind of like a throwback to those classic forms of horror, the ones that relied on atmosphere and suggestion rather than explicit visuals.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's about creating a feeling, a mood, and letting the audience's imagination do the rest.
Which, honestly, is a lot harder to pull off than just throwing a bunch of jump scares at the screen.
Oh, for sure. It requires a real mastery of storytelling, of knowing how to use sound, visuals, pacing, everything to build that sense of dread.
And it sounds like this director has that mastery, at least according to the essayist.
Yeah, they were pretty impressed with his ability to create this world that's both beautiful and terrifying.
Okay, so final thoughts. Would you recommend this remake?
I'd say if you're a fan of horror that's more psychological, more atmospheric, then absolutely. It's not going to be for everyone. But if you're looking for something that's going to stay with you, make you think, maybe even keep you up at night, then this is the film for you.
Awesome. And I think that's a great place to wrap things up for today. We've covered a lot of ground, from the director's vision to the revamped characters, that intense spiritual stuff, the music, the visuals.
It's been quite a deep dive. And I always say the best deep dives are the ones that leave you with more questions than answers.
Absolutely. Because it means we're engaging with the material, we're thinking critically, we're not just passively consuming.
And that's what we're all about here, right? Encouraging our listeners to think for themselves, to explore different perspectives, to dive deep into the things that fascinate them.
Exactly. So to our listeners, we say this. Go watch both versions of Nosferatu. Experience the original with its stark beauty and its primal terror, and then check out the remake with its visual grandeur and its psychological complexity.
Compare and contrast, see what resonates with you, and maybe even come back here and share your thoughts with us.
We'd love to hear your take. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and never be afraid to delve into the shadows with us.
See ya in the darkness.